Hello, it's the Great Canadian Bagel here, coming to another update to the Canadian federal landscape here. I would say election forecast, but there's no election on the time anywhere in the timetable, so this is more academic than anything. Because my general rule of thumb for these kind of things is if the election is not within about the next 6 months, the forecast is meaningless to actual seat totals. In other words, right now I'm forecasting Liberal winning a slight minority. And actually, I just made a mistake. I forgot to list the Greens as one here. So yes, with Green support, it would be a very slight minority. Razor thin. But this doesn't really mean too much because it's unlikely we'll see an election at least until I'm going to say October 2023. That'd be the closest election I could see. And that would really require Trudeau to give Singh a reason to back out of his agreement, though I don't think Singh will, because I don't think Singh actually wants to take down Trudeau's government. No matter what he says, no matter the rhetoric, I think Singh would rather keep Trudeau in office than potentially gain seats for the NDP. But ignoring that, it's very likely, or the only reason these forecasts are interesting, useful, or meaningful at all is it gives people, my wonderful viewers, an idea of where the landscape is going. It gives people the idea of how different events that are happening are affecting the landscape, and gives people the rough idea of the state of the government. And for politicians, if they watch these, and I don't think any do because I'm pretty small, but if some did, it would also give them the knowledge. Like if Trudeau watched me, he would know right now he's not looking hot. He's still going to win, but again, we're talking 170 seats to 168 for the Conservative bloc. I mean, I do lump Conservatives and the bloc together in this case because I think for minority government position, the bloc will always support the Conservatives before the Liberals. So if the Conservatives even had 2 more seats here, I think the bloc would sooner support a Conservative 140 seat to a Liberal 151. Though, that's a bit of speculation, but generally speaking, the Conservatives are more pro regional autonomy. And if nothing else, that is something the bloc enjoys. And the Liberals tend to be more centralists, which is something the bloc hates. Ignoring every other policy consideration. But if you do break down polling by policy lines on various issues, the bloc tends to split the difference between the Liberals and the Conservatives on essentially every single issue that exists in Canada. Now you can point to some issues like pro-life versus pro-choice. The bloc screws extremely pro-choice, but that's not an issue in Canada, frankly. When was the last time the Conservative Party intentionally wanted to do anything? Never. I don't need, Brian Mulroney 40 years ago, so it's not an issue no matter how much Liberals want it to be an issue here. But mostly, this is so people can watch and conceptualize how events in Canada and the world are affecting things. Because I'm sure I'm not alone here in that I will see some big thing happen in the news, let's say inflation right now, and be like, how is this affecting the incumbent? And short answer, bad. And that's the main use of this. And with that, though, I'm going to go through stuff. So we had a bunch of polls recently, some from Ecos, obviously we have weekly Nanos polls, which I can't talk too much in detail about because subscriber agreements. But we had a good number of polls since I last did an update for this, and there's a couple things that are interesting. I made a post about this on Twitter. The online polls, i.e., online panels like Leisure, Abacus, lesser extent Angus Reid, but Angus Reid hasn't polled in a while, so I can't really lump them into the same trend. In a while, I think the last one is like early March. I think we'll see another Angus poll in June. They generally do one every quarter. And the online polls, the telephone polls, either IVR or in-person interview from Nanos, Ecos, and Main Street, have very divergent results. Now, normally, these two groups have divergent results in that the demographics in both are different, but their headlines tend to agree. In other words, the online polls typically measure the conservatives doing a lot better with men, a lot worse with women, whereas the online polls have them more even. Similarly, these days, the telephone polls report the conservatives doing best with either under 35s or the 35 to 54 demo, depends on the poll, and the worst with 55 plus. Online polls have that the exact opposite. But on top of these issues that you normally see, we're also seeing now that there's a very large divergence in headline numbers. The telephone polls, the last one available at the time of recording of this for Ecos, Main Street, and Nanos, that are publicly available, all had the conservatives up +6, whereas the last two online polls had the conservatives and liberals effectively tied, within margin of error. I believe Abacus had the conservatives up +2 and the liberals, or Leisure had the liberals up +2, but both were within margin of error. This is a very large difference. And it's a very important difference because I don't think we can just assume in 2022 that the telephone polls are more accurate, because historically, Main Street, for example, and Abacus have about the same track record in election accuracy. So we can't assume Main Street is better than Abacus, and same thing, Nanos and Leisure have about the same accuracy rate. And by accuracy, I mean they're very similar, or they're about the same error when forecasting popular vote numbers come election day. So I don't know, we can just naively assume that the telephone polls are better because the track records of the online telephone pollsters are about the same. Ecos has been an outlier, but Ecos has always been a bit of an outlier. I think it's something to do with their and I don't think it's the methodology of Ecos that holds them back. They just have very low sample sizes. Like, oftentimes they'll poll Saskatchewan and Manitoba with like less than 20 people, which is not statistically valid. I don't even know why they bother. Like, Ecos, who's ever funding you, they can't chip in another like couple hundred, or I'm not sure how much money it costs actually, but the extra money to poll twice as many people in Saskatchewan and Manitoba, like, this isn't necessarily Ecos' fault, it's whoever's paying for the poll's fault, but like, what are you guys doing? The margin of error is just so high when you're only polling like 16 people. But yeah, so this leads to an interesting situation here. So right now, full disclaimer, there is more online poll or telephone polls included in my model than online, just because the telephone pollsters poll more frequently. Why? I don't know. But they do. Well, I know why Nanos does, because people actually pay them. Like myself. is just subscribed to their services for their daily or weekly polling, so that's just their business model there. But the interesting thing here is how this affects things. So right now, I think my model, assuming that these two pollsters, polling like one of these polling types, isn't completely wrong, my model is probably slightly skewed towards the conservatives right now because I have more telephone polls. And I don't think we should assume that one or the other is better. I think we should just assume the median point between these two is probably the more accurate, or the average. But that is an assumption on my side. So we get in this like situation though. Why? Why would the telephone polls be recording a larger number for the conservatives versus online? Now, there's a couple potential reasons for this. This is mostly not entirely speculation, but this is let's call it a hypothesis. This is my hypothesis. So, to be in an online poll, a voter has to know of the pollster. They have to go to their website. They have to sign up to be part of their polling forum or polling panel, in the case of Leisure or Angus Reid, and then they have to answer polls. But specifically, this is my understanding. It might not be 100% correct. I don't work at another company, but my understanding is they can't just selectively answer federal election polls. They have to answer some more polls than just that in an effort to weed out bots. Because it is also worth noting, an online panel is susceptible to bots. That is not to say I think Leisure or Abacus or Angus Reid numbers are different because bots are responding to their polls. For now, since all three of those pollsters are relatively good, have faith that they are weeding out bots. But that does mean their panel is a much higher burden of entry for an average person. However, that also means that the people in their panel are the most likely to vote. Because anyone who's on, say, a Leisure panel is someone who is active and interested enough in politics to A, proactively sign up, and B, answer enough surveys to qualify for election surveys. I don't know what that number is, but that is my understanding of how these work. So you are skewing to a much more active segment of the population and a much more what's the word for it? Politically aware. That said, being politically aware doesn't necessarily mean they better understand the issues. They just interact with politics more, which likely means the voter base on these platforms extremely skews activist, i.e., the core card-carrying members of each party or various lobby groups. Conversely, a properly conducted telephone survey is truly random. The online panels have a selection bias, as I just described. The telephone do not. It is completely random. You pick up the phone, they ask you a bunch of questions, and you answer them. Ecos and Main Street use IVR, so that's even superior in theory. IVR being interactive voice response, i.e., they get a robot to call you, and you answer by touching your numpad on your phone. So you don't even have to say anything. You don't have to even you don't have the potential embarrassment some people might have of telling a random stranger their political views. You're telling it to a robot. It doesn't care. It's a robot. This, though, means you're going to reach a lot of voters, more voters, who are not hardcore voters, i.e. they're not like the 100% we're always going to vote voters. The online panels are almost always going to have the I'm always going to vote voters in them. Whereas the telephone polls are more likely, by virtue of it being random versus being a selection bias, to have any arbitrary person. And considering, I believe, like 35 to 40% of Canadians don't vote most elections, you're more likely to have Canadians like that answering the polls. So it is very possible right now that these two groups are correct, but if you filtered out for would 100% vote, the telephone polls might be getting a smaller result for the Conservatives. It could be that a lot of people will be open to voting Conservative, but they just don't vote. That is a possible solution. I also suspect that's why Main Street and Ecos, by the way, often report very large numbers for the People's Party. The People's Party is essentially the vehicle of the disenchanted and disenfranchised voters in Canada. So I think they actually have quite a lot of popularity. Sometimes you see Main Street had them as high as, I think, 10% last election. I don't actually think Main Street was wrong. I don't think that was polling error. I just think they are polling people who don't actually vote. So, of the general population, I have no surprise if People's Party has 10% support among the general population who would vote for them. But I also wouldn't be surprised if half of those people won't vote in an election. 'Tis the downside of being the party of the disenfranchised and disenchanted. They're disenfranchised and disenchanted, so they don't vote very frequently. So that's likely part of it too, why the difference is there. Though it's not 100% why the difference is there, but I think that is the main reason. But that said, that doesn't really answer why their demographics are so different. It could explain why the headline numbers are different. But the most interesting one to me, we'll just quote the most recent Abacus one had, I believe, 20% support for the Conservatives among under 35s. In fact, actually, you can bear with me. Just checking something. And just want to double check this, guys. I want to say the number, and I don't always prepare very well. It was like 25% for the under 35s. There's some interpolation there because their numbers aren't lined up in that manner, but about 25%. And Ecos, which polled just a few days later. Okay, technically speaking, it was 11 days later. Had the Conservatives at 38% among under 35s. And Main Street, who polled 7 days earlier, had the Conservatives at 39% among under 35s. This cannot actually be explained by the theory I just laid out here, or the hypothesis I just laid out here. Because, yes, young voters are the least likely to vote, but we're talking about a huge discrepancy here. In the case of Main Street, you would be talking to go from 39% voting Conservative and 19% voting Liberal to Abacus's approximately 32% voting Liberal and 25% voting Conservative, you'd have to have like 15 percentage points of the populace polled not vote. And even then, the math would be, it would probably be within margin of error, but like, you would basically be requiring almost the entirety of the youth who don't vote to be conservatives. We're not talking about, like, overall, we're talking in these two surveys, the Liberals are at 31% in Abacus and Conservatives are at 33%. And in Main Street, the Conservatives are at 38% and the Liberals at 32%. So we could assume here that because of these numbers, some Liberals are also not voting, some Conservatives are not voting. And potentially, if we take in some biases from an online panel, maybe the Conservatives being a little underreported by Abacus. To be honest, I think Abacus does actually underreport things because for some reason they apparently only sampled 300 Conservatives to 461 Liberals. I don't know how their internal math is working out there, but it seems suspect that they're undersampling. And this is voters from 2021, considering there's more conservative voters than Liberal voters in 2021. It seems strange to undersample conservative 2021 voters. But that's a whole different kettle of fish. So we have this puzzle here. And this is where my job, well, it's not really a job, where my task as someone who does polling analysis and forecasting gets tricky because these are wildly divergent numbers. It is hard to fathom a world where these two numbers should coexist without assuming major polling error. But who? Who is committing the major polling error? Because again, almost all of the telephone pollsters and almost all of the online pollsters agree with each other. The online agree with the online. The telephone agree with the telephone. Almost entirely. There's some changes from poll over poll for telephones and for online and such. But broadly speaking, the telephone polls and the online polls agree. But they disagree with each other. And it adds an incredible amount of error with this, because if we assume for a moment that Main Street is right and that the Conservatives are absolutely dominating the under 35 demo, 40% to 20% of the Liberals, just dominating it. And for the record, 29% of the NDP. We would assume, if we're looking at all of Canada here, that the Lower Mainland, GTA, Montreal are very much in play for the Conservatives because major urban areas skew way younger than rural areas. We'd also assume then that places like downtown Toronto should be skewing towards the NDP. Because again, these areas are overwhelmingly young. Or at least younger compared to the general population. But if we look at it by Abacus's numbers, and I'm just picking on Abacus and Main Street because they're the two most recent ones that I have a lot of confidence in. And by a lot of confidence, I mean they have very good track records. By Abacus's numbers, we would expect kind of the status quo in Canada, where the big cities vote Liberal, with the NDP doing mediocre in them, and the rural areas voting heavily Conservative. Which shouldn't be that surprising, which is kind of the status quo. These are two very different outlines. And I don't know which one to call. It makes intuitive sense for me based off of the Liberals' failures on things like inflation and housing, and people like Poilievre campaigning super hard on those things, that the Conservatives are attractive to more young people than the Liberals. That does make intuitive sense. And a lot of polls agree with that. So generally speaking, in previous videos, that's generally been my narrative, because it does make the most sense. But it's not an uncontested narrative, because these online polls, who are also good pollsters, disagree with this. And it's a riddle that is essentially impossible to disentangle. The only, I guess you could say the way to do it is just get more data. But, well, I don't have the power to get more data. I can only get what's publicly available. And even if I had the money to spend, I don't think I'd be spending polling Canada federally right now. I'd probably spending it polling in Ontario provincially, or saving up for future elections that I'm going to be covering, which, for those interested, I am planning on covering Quebec and the U.S. midterm elections in October and November. Though that's probably only going to start up in the summer, because, well, as previously said, if you're too far away from the election day, the forecast doesn't really mean much. The only reason I really do these for Canada is because I'm Canadian. If I was American, I'd probably be doing these for America right now. If I was French, I'd be doing these in France. But as a Canadian, I'm more interested in my own politics than other people, other countries. So there is that. So yes, the great riddle of why the Canadian pollsters are diverging from each other. And I don't think there's a really easy way to resolve this. So, I think going forward, anyone watching my series on Canada, just make sure to keep in mind that, and I'll try to make sure I mention this every time, that the type of polls that I most recently added could cause huge swings. If the online polls keep having it a very tight race, and the telephone polls keep having it as a very large conservative lead, if I get a bunch of online polls, it's going to looks like it narrows a lot. Or I guess in this case, the Liberal lead increases a lot. If I get a lot of telephone polls, it's going to look the opposite. Maybe the Conservatives will be leading federally. But until these pollsters converge, or we have an election and one of them can be proven to be worse than the others, and I can weigh that in how I'm looking at this, we're going to have this dance here. Now, before I end here, I'll just show some of the raw number changes. There's not a lot. The Bloc is losing a bit of ground, but I think the Bloc tends to lose a lot of ground between elections because the Quebec voters are very fluid. And oftentimes they go vote Bloc in an election not because they like the Bloc, but because they hate every other candidate. And Bloc is pro-Quebec, obviously. So a Quebecer parking their vote with the Bloc is a very safe vote. It's the only thing I could really think of is if you're an Anglophone Quebecer or a pro-life Quebecer, they're a terrible person to park your vote. But other than those two types of people, it's very safe as a Quebecer to park your vote with the Bloc. They're likely not going to support things that are going to hurt you. So there's that. Similarly, we're seeing some numbers along Other and Peoples and Green, and a little bit NDP gaining some ground. Again, really these aren't that surprising, because typically speaking, the further you are from an election day, the better all the smaller parties do, because you don't have the people tend to in polls between elections, people tend to vote to poll conscience, the party they like the best. Whereas polls during a campaign, people tend to poll who they are actually going to vote for. Because there is a difference, right? You might, for example, let's say you really like the NDP. So in between elections, you might poll saying, I like the NDP more. But then it comes election day, an election campaign, you're seeing the stuff going on, and you're like, well, NDP aren't going to win my riding, so I'm going to vote the Liberals. So then when you're polled, you say that, because that's your intention now. And now, yeah, some of this is informed by campaigns, and some of it's informed by the media, and some of it's informed by polling and videos like this one. So there's always that too, but it is what it is. Moving on to the main two parties. The Liberals taking a slight hit again, about 0.4. Similarly, they lost 0.4 last update. So I think we can assume that they're likely still sliding down, and it's likely going to continue sliding down, at least until things like inflation and housing, just to name two, are addressed. Though it's not looking like the Trudeau government has any intention of addressing housing, because the last budget they released, frankly, shouldn't do anything. If it does, if something changes in housing, it's not going to be the effect of the feds. It's going to be likely the market cooling off because of the interest rates going up by the central bank, which is different. The Conservatives are down some from last week. Not a ton, just a little bit. That's likely just fluctuation. Maybe they're losing a bit of ground, because maybe. But it's such a small amount that I'm not really confident to say that they're losing ground. It could just be fluctuations, because again, if you look at where a lot of the Conservatives lost votes between last week and this week, they lost vote share in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and BC, which, I mean, maybe they're losing ground, but I wouldn't be that surprised to come election day that, like, the most conservative areas are losing support, and the rest of the country is not losing much support, other than PEI. And like, PEI is a super high margin of error on it, for the record, so that doesn't mean much. So maybe they're losing ground, but it looks like it's just a fluctuation, because a small fluctuation in the prairies because of polls. Because I'll also note the prairies have wild polling. Like, sometimes they are polled just absolutely comically. Like, I'm trying to find an example here. No, it's not like I can find an example I can talk about, like, recently, but there'll be times when, like, Saskatchewan and Manitoba are polled, like, collectively 40% for the Conservatives, and it's just like, what? I don't even think that's ever happened in history, at least in relevant history, like maybe 60 years ago, but Manitoba, Saskatchewan getting less than 40%, which you do, again, sometimes see a poll return that. It's just like, did you poll like Winnipeg and like Regina and nowhere else? Actually, is Regina even that? I don't want. I guess I'll say liberal. I don't know. Similarly, sometimes you see Alberta numbers that low, and it's like, again, when does it happen? For some reason, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and Atlantic Canada are like the dumbest regards to polling, because and BC, basically anything that's not Quebec and Ontario just has comical polling in Canada. Like, poll over poll will report wildly different numbers from the same pollster. And it's like, what? You'll see like one poll has Alberta doing or considers doing terrible in Alberta, and the next poll they're doing great, or one poll considers doing terrible in Atlantic Canada, the next poll they're doing great in Atlantic Canada. It's like, what is this? How? I don't know. You don't see this. Maybe it's sample size. It's probably sample size related because the sample size, so only subsamples are smaller. But at the same time, it's still pretty high volatility, so it's a bit silly. That all said, though, I'll wrap up the video here. If you liked it, it's a bit of a slightly different one than normal. So let me know in the comments below if you liked the slightly different take or if you prefer my normal style. We'll see. Otherwise, though, liking it. If you liked the video, make sure you press the like button. Comment anything. Gotta trick that algorithm and think people like these videos. I hope people like these videos. Share it with anyone you want to share with. That's always helpful. Just general notes. There was discussion in the past about doing live streams that are not directly related to debates and or possibly election nights. I am looking at doing one on Friday at 6 Eastern Time to about 9 Eastern Time. On Thursday, I will confirm or deny if that's happening. There is a few things that might impede that. But, assuming that doesn't occur, that'll be happening. And I'll also note, just preemptively, I will be doing a live stream on election night in Ontario. Don't know all the details yet, but I'll keep you posted. It'll just be like election night coverage. Otherwise, you like the video? Do all the things. I said it like 3 times now. Would you rather all the shilling at the end or shill at the beginning? Let me know. Otherwise, have a great day.